What would you do if you woke up every morning to find your prized garden mysteriously raided, your hard-earned harvest vanishing without a single trace? No footprints, no broken fences, just empty stems, as if a ghost had swept through in the dead of night. That's exactly what Ethan Carter was dealing with, and it was driving him insane. Ethan had always taken pride in his backyard garden. It wasn't just a hobby, it was his sanctuary. The rows of lush green plants, the delicate aroma of fresh herbs, and most importantly, his strawberries, vibrant red, plump and sweet, nurtured with weeks of patience and care. But lately, those strawberries had been disappearing. Not one or two, dozens. Each morning, he'd step outside, expecting to see the results of his dedication, only to be met with bare, chewed-off stems, mocking him under the morning sun. At first, he thought it was an animal. Maybe raccoons? Birds? But the strange part was that nothing else was disturbed. The netting around the plants remained untouched. The soil was smooth, no paw prints or trails leading in or out. Whatever was taking his strawberries was surgical, precise, and incredibly smug about it. Then, as if on cue, his neighbor Karen Walker appeared. Leaning casually against the fence, she had the self-satisfied smirk of someone who wasn't guilty, but wanted you to think they might be. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled into its usual stiff bob, sunglasses perched on top of her head as if she were a celebrity dodging paparazzi. But it wasn't her stance that caught Ethan's attention. It was her lips, stained a deep, suspicious shade of red. "Morning, Ethan," Karen greeted sweetly, licking her fingers clean. Ethan's stomach clenched. His eyes flicked to her hands, a faint smear of berry juice. His jaw tightened. For the past week, he had suspected Karen was behind the strawberry heist, but this? This was practically a confession. He forced a calm smile. "Morning, Karen. Enjoying some fruit?" Karen gasped dramatically, pressing a manicured hand to her chest. "Oh, these? Just some from my fridge. You know, the organic kind. So expensive but totally worth it." Ethan's fingers curled into fists. His strawberries were organic too. Because they were his. And Karen? Karen hadn't bought fresh produce in months. Something inside him snapped. This wasn't just petty theft anymore. This was a game to her. And if she wanted to play, he was going to make sure she lost. Ethan spent the next few days watching Karen like a hawk, but if she knew he suspected her, she didn't show it. She carried on as usual, strolling around the neighborhood like she owned it, making passive-aggressive comments about people's lawns, and of course, bragging about her so-called gardening skills. The audacity of it all made his blood boil. The last straw came at the grocery store. He was picking up some supplies when he heard Karen's unmistakable voice at the checkout counter. "Oh, you should see the strawberries I grow at home," she was telling the cashier, her tone dripping with fake humility. "Best in the neighborhood. So sweet and juicy. I take them to my book club, and everyone begs for more." Ethan nearly dropped the carton of milk in his hand. His strawberries. The ones she had been stealing, she was now parading around town as her own. That was it. She wanted a war. She was about to get one. That night, Ethan sat in his living room, pacing, brainstorming every possible way to put an end to Karen's thieving. Confronting her wouldn't work, she'd just lie and play the victim. Security footage? She'd gaslight him into thinking he imagined it. Maybe he could install an electric fence. Too extreme. Call the police? They had bigger things to worry about than a strawberry-stealing lunatic. He was about to give up when, scrolling through a gardening forum, he stumbled upon a post that changed everything. A rare hybrid plant. Chili berries. They looked exactly like strawberries, but inside, they carried the firepower of a ghost pepper. One bite, and your mouth would feel like it was melting from the inside out. Ethan sat up straight. Oh, this was perfect. By morning, he was on the road, driving 2 towns over to a specialty gardening store. The shopkeeper, a gruff older man, raised an eyebrow when Ethan explained what he was looking for. "These aren't a joke," the man warned, handing over a packet of seeds. "They burn worse than a breakup text." "Perfect," Ethan said, grinning. Over the next few days, he carefully planted the chili berries among his Real strawberries, taking extra care to hide his actual crop in a separate patch. He made sure the new plants blended in seamlessly, just waiting for the moment Karen's greedy little hands reached for them. Then, the waiting game began. For 2 nights, nothing happened. Ethan started to worry that Karen had caught on. Maybe she had moved on to another victim. But on the 3rd night, as he reviewed his hidden camera footage, he caught her in the act. Dressed in all black, like some kind of cartoon burglar, Karen tiptoed into his yard, moving with practiced precision. She plucked one berry, then another, stuffing them into a small cloth bag before sneaking back into her house like she hadn't just committed grand theft fruit. Ethan could barely contain his excitement. By the next morning, he was ready for the show. He set up a lawn chair in his front yard, grabbed his coffee, and settled in, waiting for the moment of reckoning. It didn't take long. A scream shattered the peaceful morning air. It was a sound of pure agony, a high-pitched wail so piercing that birds launched from the trees in panic. Ethan took a slow sip of his coffee, suppressing a grin. Then, bam, Karen's front door flew open. She came barreling out of her house, arms flailing, her face an alarming shade of red. Her mouth hung open as she gasped for air, eyes bulging in horror. Her once perfectly styled hair was a mess, and sweat beaded across her forehead. "My mouth! My tongue! It's on fire," she shrieked, stumbling into the yard like she'd been set ablaze from the inside. Ethan nearly choked on his coffee. It was even better than he had imagined. Karen whirled in circles, gagging, hiccuping, and gasping for breath like a fish thrown onto dry land. Desperate, she sprinted to her garden hose, fumbling with the handle, twisting it wildly. Nothing. Ethan had shut off her water supply the night before. Just in case. Karen let out a primal scream. "No! No, no, no," she sobbed, clawing at her tongue. "Somebody help me. I'm dying." By now, half the neighborhood had gathered. Curtains were yanked open, doors creaked, and a few neighbors stepped onto their porches, watching the spectacle unfold. From next door, Mr. Harris rubbed his eyes, his robe barely tied as he squinted at the chaos. "Karen, what the hell is going on?" Karen spun to face Ethan, her entire body trembling with fury. "He poisoned me," she bellowed, pointing a shaking finger at him. Ethan stood, stretching lazily. "Poisoned you?" he repeated, feigning concern. "Karen, you look a little flustered." "You know what you did," she screamed, her voice raw from the burn. Ethan tilted his head. "Oh, wait, you mean the strawberries that keep mysteriously disappearing from my garden?" Karen's face went through an impressive transformation. Rage. Realization. Horror. She opened her mouth to lie, but then her body betrayed her. A violent hiccup rocked through her chest. Then another. Her eyes watered. Her throat clenched. The hiccups turned into desperate gasps, her body reacting to the chili's full force. Ethan finally took pity. He reached into his cooler and pulled out a bottle of milk. Karen lunged for it, tearing off the cap and gulping it down in the most undignified way possible. By the time she finished, her face was drenched in sweat, her dignity obliterated. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a chuckle. Mrs. Henderson from across the street. Then a snort from Ryan. Then, one by one, the entire neighborhood erupted into hysterics. Karen, the terror of the cul-de-sac, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, had just been brought to her knees by a fruit. Her face twisted with fury. "This isn't over," she growled, wiping her mouth. Ethan crossed his arms, smirking. "Oh, I really hope it's not." And just like that, the war had officially begun. The HOA strikes back. Karen wasn't the type to let things go. If anything, her public humiliation only made her more determined to get revenge. The next morning, Ethan stepped outside to check on his garden, still riding the high of victory. But the moment he looked toward his fence, his stomach dropped. A bright yellow HOA violation notice was taped to his mailbox. His jaw clenched as he ripped it off and read the fine print. "Dear Mr. Carter, your property has been found in violation of HOA landscaping regulations. Effective immediately, you are required to remove any unsightly gardening that does not adhere to neighborhood aesthetic standards. Failure to comply will result in additional fines and potential further action." Ethan ground his teeth. His garden? Unsightly? This was Karen's doing. Across the street, Karen sat on her porch with a smug smile, sipping an overpriced green smoothie, watching him read it. Ethan took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. This was retaliation, plain and simple. She had been stealing from his garden for weeks. Now that she had been exposed and humiliated, she was using the HOA to try and wipe his garden off the map entirely. The worst part? Technically, the HOA had the power to enforce it. He had two options: comply and destroy everything he had built, or fight back. Ethan's fingers tightened around the notice. Karen wanted a war. She was about to find out exactly who she was messing with. Ethan had dealt with Karen's pettiness before, but this was a new low. Using the HOA to wipe out his garden wasn't just annoying, it was a declaration of war. She had spent weeks stealing from him, lying about it, even selling his own strawberries, and now that she'd been caught, she wanted to punish him for daring to expose her. But Ethan wasn't the type to roll over. If Karen thought he was just going to stand there and watch his garden be destroyed, she was dead wrong. He had 2 days to comply with the HOA's demands, which meant 2 days to find a way to turn this back on her. But before he could put any plan into action, Karen struck again. This time, she called the police. Ethan had barely finished breakfast and a patrol car pulled into his driveway. He stepped outside, coffee in hand, as 2 officers climbed out, one of them adjusting his belt while the other pulled out a notepad. "Mr. Carter?" Ethan nodded, already guessing exactly what this was about. "We received a report from your neighbor claiming that you intentionally poisoned her food." Ethan couldn't stop the laugh that burst out of him. The first officer rubbed his temple, clearly already done with this nonsense. "Sir, do you grow strawberries in your backyard?" "I do." "Did you recently introduce another plant into your garden?" "I did." The second officer sighed. "Did this plant resemble strawberries but was actually a spicy variant?" Ethan smirked. "It did." The first officer let out a low chuckle, then disguised it with a cough. "Look," the second officer continued, flipping through his notes, "your neighbor claims you set a trap to cause her harm. We're not saying you did anything illegal, but she's adamant that this was intentional." Ethan crossed his arms. "Did she also mention that she stole them from my yard?" "She claims they were left on her porch as a gift." "Of course she did." Ethan shook his head. "Officers, I have security footage of her sneaking into my yard and taking them herself. So unless we're arresting people for stealing and then playing the victim, I think we're done here." The officers exchanged a glance before the second officer let out a tired sigh and put his notepad away. "Yeah, that's what we figured. She's been a handful to deal with." "You have no idea," Ethan muttered. The cops left, and Ethan wasted no time updating the neighborhood group chat. Karen had officially lost her mind. But if Ethan thought this was the end, he was sorely mistaken. Because the very next day, a legal notice arrived in his mailbox. Karen was suing him. The letter was ridiculous, aggressive capitalized font, accusations of intentional infliction of bodily harm, emotional distress, and wrongful horticultural practices. Ryan nearly fell out of his chair laughing when he read it. "Dude, this is the best thing that's ever happened. Are we going to court? Can I come?" Ethan rolled his eyes. "You just want to watch the chaos." Obviously. Ethan wasn't worried. Karen had no case. She had stolen from his yard, eaten the berries voluntarily, and most importantly, she was the one who turned this into a ridiculous battle. But Karen had money, and money could buy a lawyer willing to argue even the dumbest case. A week later, Ethan found himself sitting in a small beige courtroom, facing Karen and her legal representative. The moment the lawyer walked in, Ethan nearly laughed out loud. It was Daniel, Karen's ex-husband. The poor man looked exhausted, like someone who had spent years being dragged into her nonsense and had long since given up the will to fight. As he sat down beside her, he didn't even glance in her direction. Karen, on the other hand, looked smug, as if she had already won. The judge, a stern-looking older woman with silver hair, peered down at the documents in front of her. "Miss Walker, you are claiming that the defendant, Mr. Carter, deliberately harmed you with a toxic plant?" Karen nodded dramatically, slipping into her best wronged victim expression. "Yes, Your Honor. It was a calculated attack. He planted those monstrous berries, knowing I would eat them." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Did he force you to eat them?" Karen hesitated. "Well, not force exactly, but he tricked me. He left them in his garden where he knew I might acquire them." The judge's expression didn't change. "So, you stole them?" Karen's mouth twitched. "That's not the point. The point is..." Daniel, looking beyond Dunn, leaned forward. "Your Honor, if I may." The judge nodded, and Daniel turned to Karen with the exhausted patience of a man who had suffered through years of her nonsense. "Karen," he said flatly, "you're suing Ethan because he grew a plant on his own property? A plant you stole? Do you hear how ridiculous that sounds?" Karen's jaw clenched. "You're my lawyer, Daniel. You're supposed to be on my side." Daniel exhaled sharply. "No, I'm supposed to argue something that makes sense, and this doesn't." The judge sighed, rubbing her temples. "Mr. Carter, do you have any evidence that the plaintiff took these berries without permission?" Ethan grinned. "I do, Your Honor." He pulled out his phone and played the security footage. The entire courtroom watched as Karen, dressed in all black like a cartoon burglar, tiptoed into his yard, plucked the berries, and stuffed them into a bag. Then, the footage zoomed in on her popping one into her mouth. The moment it hit her tongue, she froze. Then, in high-definition clarity, she dropped the bag and sprinted back into her house. The courtroom erupted into laughter. Even the judge had to cough to cover her amusement. Karen's face turned an impressive shade of red. But he knew I would take them. That's entrapment." Daniel pinched the bridge of his nose. "That's not how entrapment works, Karen." The judge sighed. "This is a waste of the court's time. Miss Walker, your case is dismissed." Karen let out an outraged squeak but had no choice but to accept her latest, most humiliating defeat. As she stormed out of the courtroom, practically vibrating with frustration, Daniel lingered for a moment, looking at Ethan. "Do yourself a favor," he muttered. "Find a way to keep her away for good. She doesn't know how to let things go." Ethan smirked. "Oh, I've got a plan." Because if Karen thought this war was over, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. Karen had lost in court, but Ethan knew she wasn't done yet. Someone like her didn't know how to take a loss gracefully. No, she needed revenge. The problem was, after being publicly humiliated, she had nothing left except pure, unfiltered pettiness. So when Ethan woke up the next morning to find a city inspector knocking on his door, clipboard in hand, he wasn't surprised. The man, looking slightly annoyed to even be there, informed him that a complaint had been filed regarding illegal water usage and hazardous plant growth. Ethan didn't even have to ask who was behind it. He played along, letting the inspector take a look, but it was obvious the guy wasn't buying it. After all, growing chili berries wasn't a crime, and his garden wasn't breaking any laws. Still, it was clear Karen wasn't going to stop. She had tried stealing from him, getting him fined, suing him, and now calling the city on him. Every single time, she lost. But Karen wasn't fighting to win anymore, she was fighting to exhaust him into giving up. Too bad for her, Ethan wasn't the giving up type. That night, he put his final plan into action. Motion-activated sprinklers, high-powered and ice-cold, lined the fence surrounding his garden. Anything that moved soaked. The system was set, the waiting game began, and Ethan didn't have to wait long. Just past midnight, movement flickered on his camera feed. Karen. She was back. Because of course she was. This time, she crept in slower, probably scanning for new cameras, completely unaware of the silent, vengeful guardians waiting for her. She took a step closer. Another. She reached a hand toward his plants. And then, whoosh. A blast of freezing cold water nailed her right in the face. She let out a screech so loud it could have shattered glass. Flailing wildly, she stumbled back, but the sprinklers were relentless. Every time she moved, another jet of water hit her from a different direction, chest, back, side, face. She twirled in circles like a malfunctioning sprinkler herself, slipping in the mud, her drenched yoga outfit clinging to her like a miserable second skin. Across the street, porch lights flicked on. A few neighbors peeked outside, drawn by the shrieking banshee that was once Karen. Ethan stepped onto his porch, arms crossed, watching his masterpiece unfold. "I hate you," Karen spat through dripping wet hair. Ethan smirked, raising his glass of lemonade. "Cheers, Karen." She stomped off, soaked, humiliated, and completely defeated. This time, there was no comeback, no final scheme. Karen had finally, truly, lost. The next morning, Ethan found something strange. No HOA notices. No city officials. No Karen. For the first time in months, peace had returned to the neighborhood. His garden was safe, his reputation intact, and most importantly, Karen had finally learned that some battles just weren't worth fighting. Or had she? Because with someone like Karen, you could never really be sure. So, what do you think? Was Ethan's revenge justified, or did Karen get exactly what she deserved? And more importantly, have you ever dealt with a Karen, or HOA, this bad? Share your stories below. I need to know who had it worse.